Will King Charles really join Prince Harry at the Invictus Games? Plus, which royals have topped the polls as Britain's favourite?
Why do King Charles and Queen Camilla spend their weekends apart? What will a King William monarchy look like? And what would realistically happen if Prince Harry were to inherit the throne? We're answering your questions today.
No longer a Windsor. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have been banished by the royal.
What could possibly be so dangerous about a visit to Diana's memorial that Harry and Meghan would reportedly be kept away? Think about that for a moment. Not a state banquet, not a royal wedding, not a political speech. A memorial. A place associated with a woman whose memory has remained one of the most powerful forces in the modern history of the British royal family. The idea should have been simple. Harry visiting the place connected to his mother, Meghan standing beside him. No ceremony, no grand announcement, no official royal appearance. Just a son paying tribute to the mother he lost when he was still a child. And yet, according to the narrative surrounding the reported visit, something went wrong. The palace was said to have resisted the idea. And suddenly, what should have been a quiet family moment became something much larger. Because the real question isn't simply, why was Harry's visit blocked? The more uncomfortable question is, what was the palace afraid this visit might represent? Was it about security? Was it about protocol? Was it about timing? Or was there something deeper happening beneath the surface? Because if this was truly nothing more than a private visit to a memorial, why did the situation become so complicated? And why does Diana's name keep appearing at the center of the story? That is where this story becomes far more interesting. Because this may not have been about a memorial at all. It may have been about memory. It may have been about family. And most importantly, it may have been about who gets to decide what Diana's legacy means. The visit that should have been simple. On the surface, there was nothing particularly controversial about the idea. Diana's memorial represents remembrance. For Harry, that remembrance is intensely personal. He was 12 years old when his mother died. For William, he was 15. 2 brothers. 1 mother. 1 devastating loss. But 2 very different lives followed. And that difference matters. Because decades later, Diana's memory means something different to each of them. For Harry, she is still the mother he remembers. The woman who made him laugh. The woman who tried to give her son something resembling a normal childhood despite living inside one of the world's most unusual families. And for William, Diana is also his mother. But she is something else. She is history. She is the Princess of Wales. She is part of the story William will one day inherit as king. And that creates the first major question. What happens when 2 brothers love the same woman, but believe her legacy means 2 completely different things? That question sits underneath almost everything that follows. Because Harry's relationship with Diana has always been emotional. William's relationship with Diana has always been emotional too. But William also carries the institutional weight of her legacy. And that difference would eventually become impossible to ignore. Then something didn't add up. The reported explanations surrounding the visit created another layer of mystery. One possible explanation was practical. COVID restrictions. At first glance, that sounds reasonable. The pandemic had changed almost every aspect of public life. Royal schedules were disrupted. Travel was complicated. Public gatherings were restricted. So perhaps that was all there was to it. But then comes the obvious question. If the problem was simply COVID, why couldn't the visit be postponed? Why couldn't Harry and Meghan come at another time? Why couldn't the arrangements be changed? And if the memorial itself was an outdoor location, did that explanation really settle the issue? Perhaps not. Then came another possible explanation. Scheduling. Royal schedules are complicated. The Queen's diary was full. William had commitments. Other members of the family had responsibilities. Again, on its own, that sounds perfectly ordinary. But Harry and Meghan weren't reportedly asking for a state occasion. They weren't asking for a parade. They weren't demanding a royal reception. The idea was presented as a private visit. So another question appears. If the problem was scheduling, why couldn't the schedule simply be changed? And then came another possible explanation. Security. That sounds serious. The royal family lives under extraordinary security considerations. But Harry and Meghan had already stepped away from their working royal roles. They were living outside Britain. And according to the narrative in circulation, they were prepared to make their own arrangements. So again, the question returns. If security was the real problem, why did every proposed solution appear to create another obstacle? This is where the story stops being about logistics and becomes about motive. Because every explanation seems to answer one question while creating another. And whenever that happens, viewers naturally start asking, what aren't we being told? The name at the center of everything. Diana. That one name changes the entire emotional weight of the story. Because Diana was never simply another member of the royal family. She became something much larger. She became an international symbol. She represented compassion, emotion, humanity, and, eventually, rebellion against the rigid expectations surrounding royal life. She challenged conventions. She spoke openly about personal struggles. She made mistakes publicly. She allowed people to see vulnerability in a way the institution had rarely permitted before. And that was part of what made her so powerful. The world didn't simply see a princess. The world saw a person. For Harry, that person was his mother. And that distinction is enormous. Because when Harry speaks about Diana, he isn't discussing history in the abstract. He's talking about someone whose absence has shaped his entire adult life. The military, his charitable work, his concerns about mental health, his public statements about the royal family. Again and again, Diana's memory appears in the background. So imagine what a memorial visit could mean to him. Not politically, not institutionally, personally. A son standing in a place connected to his mother. That should be simple. But what if the palace didn't see it that way? What if they saw something Harry didn't? Or, perhaps more accurately, what if they feared what the public might see? Then William enters the story. This is where everything becomes more complicated. Because Diana's legacy is not only Harry's. It belongs to William too. And William's relationship with Diana carries an entirely different burden. He was 15 when she died. He was the older son, the future king, the one who would eventually inherit the responsibility of representing the institution that Diana had both served and challenged. Imagine growing up knowing that your mother was one of the most famous women on earth. Then imagine losing her. And then imagine discovering that her memory would become part of the institution you were expected to lead. That is an impossible emotional equation. For Harry, Diana can represent freedom. For William, Diana can represent responsibility. For Harry, her memory may symbolize authenticity. For William, it can symbolize legacy. For Harry, honoring Diana may mean questioning the system. For William, honoring Diana may mean protecting what remains of the family. And suddenly, the reported disagreement over a visit looks very different. Because the question is no longer, should Harry visit a memorial? The question becomes, who gets to define what that memorial represents? And that is a much bigger question. The Meghan factor. Then there is Meghan. And this is where the emotional equation becomes even more complicated. Because Harry wasn't planning to make the journey alone. Meghan was part of his new life. The woman he had chosen after leaving the traditional royal system. And, according to the narrative surrounding this story, that changed how the visit could be perceived. To supporters of Harry and Meghan, Meghan's presence could simply mean one thing. A wife supporting her husband while he remembers his mother. Nothing more. But to critics, the visit could be interpreted differently. And to an institution already sensitive to public image, perception can matter almost as much as reality. This creates another question. Was the concern really about what Harry and Meghan would do, or about how their presence would be interpreted? Because Diana herself had once become extraordinarily powerful through public perception. She understood the emotional connection between the public and the monarchy. She understood that an image could sometimes communicate more than a speech. And Harry and Meghan understood that too. So imagine the optics. Harry, Meghan, Diana's memorial. The son of the late Princess of Wales standing beside his wife at a place dedicated to his mother. One photograph could tell an entire story. And perhaps that is why the question of optics becomes so important. Not because we know that this was the definitive reason, but because it explains why a seemingly private moment could potentially become a public narrative. And now we have another question. Was the palace afraid of the visit itself, or afraid of the story that could emerge from it? Every answer creates another question. This is where the story becomes almost impossible to leave alone. Suppose the issue was security. Then why couldn't security arrangements be solved? Suppose it was scheduling. Then why couldn't the date change? Suppose it was COVID. Then why not wait? Suppose it was protocol. Then why would a private family visit require the same considerations as an official royal engagement? And suppose it was optics. Then why would the palace be so concerned about how a son visiting his mother's memorial might look? Each answer seems reasonable on its own, but put them together and something feels incomplete. And that's when the viewer arrives at the question the story has been building toward from the beginning. What was the real concern? Was Harry and Meghan's visit simply inconvenient? Or could it have become symbolically powerful? Because symbols are dangerous to institutions. A single photograph can become a headline. A headline can become a narrative. And a narrative can become history. That is especially true when the person at the center of the story is Diana. The moment everything became personal. According to the narrative in the source material, Harry and Meghan were devastated when the reported visit was blocked. And if that emotional reaction is accurate, it is easy to understand why. Harry wasn't simply being denied access to a location. He may have felt that something connected to his mother was being placed beyond his reach. And that is a very different kind of pain. Because grief doesn't follow royal protocol. It doesn't care about titles. It doesn't care about institutions. It doesn't care about schedules. A son can be a prince and still be a grieving child inside. That is the emotional heart of this story. Harry can have everything the world associates with royalty: money, fame, security, privilege, and yet he cannot get one thing back: his mother. So when the story becomes about access to a place connected with Diana, the emotional stakes become enormous. And Meghan's role becomes equally important, because she isn't experiencing Harry's grief in the same way, but she is standing beside him while he experiences it. Which creates another question. Did Meghan see the refusal as a rejection of Harry, or as a rejection of both of them? And if she did, what did that mean for their relationship with the institution? The refusal that could have backfired. Here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because if the purpose of blocking the visit was to prevent controversy, it may have achieved the opposite effect. A refusal can sometimes make people more curious. A closed door creates a question. A question creates speculation. And speculation creates a story. Suddenly, Harry and Meghan don't need to stand at the memorial to talk about Diana. Diana's memory follows them everywhere. Every interview, every documentary, every memoir, every public appearance. The question keeps returning. What did Diana's life teach Harry about the institution that raised him? And that is where the reported refusal becomes part of a much larger narrative. The visit itself may have been small, but the symbolism surrounding it was enormous. Because Harry's story increasingly became one about leaving the institution while carrying his mother's memory with him. And that creates another uncomfortable question. Did the palace's attempt to control one moment accidentally strengthen the larger story? Two brothers, two Dianas. Perhaps the most powerful way to understand the conflict is to recognize that Harry and William may not actually be fighting over their mother. They may be fighting over what her legacy means. For Harry, Diana represents freedom. She represents compassion. She represents speaking honestly. She represents refusing to hide pain simply because the institution expects silence. For William, Diana represents duty. She represents family. She represents the responsibility of carrying a name that belongs to generations. She represents the importance of protecting the institution even when that protection is personally painful. Neither interpretation necessarily erases the other, but they can collide. And when they do, the conflict becomes almost impossible to resolve. Because there is no objective answer to the question, what would Diana have wanted? Everyone can interpret her differently. Harry can believe he is honoring her by challenging the system. William can believe he is honoring her by protecting the institution. And the palace can believe it is honoring her by preserving her memory within the royal framework. Three interpretations. One woman, one legacy, and two brothers caught between them. So what was the palace really afraid of? This brings us back to the opening question. What could possibly be so dangerous about a visit to Diana's memorial? Perhaps the answer isn't that the palace feared Harry and Meghan as individuals. Perhaps the deeper fear within the narrative of this story was what they represented. Harry represented a royal who had stepped outside the institution. Meghan represented an outsider who had entered it, challenged it, and then left it. And Diana represented the original royal who had exposed the emotional limitations of that institution. Put those three elements together, and you have a powerful symbol. Harry, Meghan, Diana, past, present, future. And suddenly, the memorial is no longer just a memorial. It becomes a meeting point between three versions of the royal family. The royal family Diana experienced, the royal family Harry and Meghan experienced, and the royal family that William will eventually lead. That is why the question of legacy becomes so important. Because whoever controls the meaning of Diana's story has influence over how the royal family itself is remembered. But there is one final twist. If Harry and Meghan were truly trying to honor Diana, perhaps the refusal didn't accomplish what anyone expected. Because they didn't need permission to remember her. They didn't need a palace invitation to love her. And they certainly didn't need institutional approval to tell their own story about what she meant to them. In fact, the more the institution appeared resistant, the more powerful Diana's memory could become within Harry's own narrative. And that creates the final contradiction. Could trying to control Diana's legacy actually make that legacy harder to control? That is the question that remains. Because memories belong to people. Institutions can preserve monuments. They can control ceremonies. They can manage schedules. They can decide who appears where. But they cannot completely control what a mother means to her son. And they cannot completely control how the public remembers a woman who became larger than the institution she once belonged to. The final question. So is this really about a visit? Maybe. Was it about security? Possibly. Was it about timing? Perhaps. Was it about optics? That may have played a role. But if we step back from all of those explanations, another story emerges. A story about two brothers. Two interpretations of the same mother. Two different relationships with the institution. And one legacy that remains too powerful to ignore. For Harry, Diana is the mother he lost. For William, she is the mother he lost and the legacy he inherited. For the palace, she remains one of the most complicated figures in modern royal history. And for the public, she remains Diana, the princess who changed the emotional language of royalty, the woman who made the institution look human, the woman whose life demonstrated how powerful authenticity could become. And perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate. Because the real conflict isn't simply Harry versus William. It isn't Harry and Meghan versus the palace. And it isn't even about a memorial. The deeper conflict is about who gets to tell the story, who gets to decide what Diana represented, who gets to decide what her sons should learn from her, who gets to decide whether her legacy is about duty, or freedom, tradition, or transformation, silence, or honesty. And that brings us back to the question we started with. What was the palace really afraid of? Perhaps it wasn't Harry. Perhaps it wasn't Meghan. Perhaps it wasn't even the visit. Perhaps the fear was what the visit symbolized. A son standing beside his wife, at his mother's memorial, outside the institution, remembering a woman whose greatest power came from refusing to become merely a symbol. And if that is what the palace feared, then the refusal may have been far more significant than anyone realized. Because you can block a visit, you can close a door, you can control an event, but you cannot block a memory, and you cannot stop people from asking questions, especially when every answer creates another question. So perhaps the real story was never, why couldn't Harry and Meghan visit Diana's memorial? Perhaps the real story was, why did the idea of that visit become so uncomfortable in the first place? Was it because of Harry? Was it because of Meghan? Was it because of William? Or was it because Diana's legacy still has the power to expose the tension between the family and the institution? And if Harry and Meghan continue to invoke that legacy, one question becomes even more important. Who will ultimately decide what Diana's legacy means? Harry? William? The palace? Or the millions of people who still remember her? Because perhaps Diana's greatest legacy was never a building, a garden, a title, or a memorial. Perhaps it was the idea that royalty could be human, that power could show vulnerability, that tradition could be challenged, and that sometimes telling the truth matters more than protecting an image. If that is the legacy Harry believes his mother left behind, then perhaps this story was never about one blocked visit. It was about a much bigger battle. A battle over memory, a battle over identity, a battle over family, and ultimately, a battle over the future meaning of the monarchy itself. Because the question isn't simply whether Harry and Meghan can change the royal family. The question is whether the royal family can continue changing without confronting the parts of its past that still refuse to disappear. And Diana's memory is one of those parts. She is still there, in Harry's memories, in William's responsibilities, in the public imagination, and in every argument over what the monarchy should become. So perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all isn't, why did the palace say no? It's this. What happens when the people trying to protect Diana's legacy and the people trying to redefine it both believe they are honoring her? Because then there is no simple villain, no simple answer, and no simple ending. Only a legacy, a family, two brothers, and a question that may remain unanswered for years. Who really gets to decide what Diana's story means?